Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the ocean. Not the ocean as we know it today. Charted, mapped, photographed from space, its every current measured and recorded. Imagine the ocean as it once was. Vast, unknowable. A grey-green wall at the edge of the horizon that simply ended into nothing, into darkness, into whatever gods had placed there to remind men of their smallness. For most of human history, that wall held, not because men lacked courage. They had courage in extraordinary abundance, not because they lacked curiosity. Curiosity has always been the most stubbornly human of all instincts. What they lacked, for centuries upon centuries, was something far more practical. They lacked the right ship to understand why the Caravel mattered, why it changed everything, why historians speak of it in the same breath as the compass, the printing press, and the cannon. You must first understand what came before it. You must understand the sea and the vessels men trusted with their lives long before anyone had ever spoken the word Caravel aloud. The Mediterranean had always been Europe's great teacher of sailing. Calm, relatively predictable, enclosed on all sides like a long, ancient classroom. And the ships that sailed her reflected that temperament perfectly. The dominant vessel of the medieval Mediterranean was the galley. Long, low, and brutally efficient in the sheltered waters it was designed for. Propelled by banks of oars, sometimes dozens of them, the galley was a creature of muscle and rhythm. It was a warship, a trader, a symbol of power for centuries of empires. Roman, Byzantine, Venetian, Ottoman. But the galley had a profound and crippling weakness. It was, in almost every meaningful sense, a coastal animal. Its hull sat dangerously low in the water. The open rowing decks invited waves aboard with shocking ease in rougher seas. It was enormously heavy, requiring constant manpower simply to move, and that manpower needed feeding, meaning cargo space was consumed not by goods but by men, water, and grain just to keep those men alive. Take a galley beyond the sheltered blue of the Mediterranean, out past the Strait of Gibraltar and into the grey, heaving swells of the Atlantic Ocean, and you were not sailing. You were gambling. Badly. The Northern European answer to this problem was no more elegant. The cog, the workhorse of the Baltic and the North Sea, was broad, round-bellied, and sturdy, built for volume, built for the timber, wool, and salted fish trades of the Hanseatic League. The cog had a single mast and a single square sail, which made it entirely dependent on a favorable wind blowing from behind. Turn the cog across the wind, or worse, try to sail it into the wind, and the vessel simply refused. It would drift, helplessly, at the mercy of whatever direction the Atlantic chose to blow on any given morning. And the Atlantic, famously, rarely blew in the direction a sailor needed. There were other vessels, the Nef, the Hulk, the lateen-rigged fishing boats of the Iberian coast, quick and responsive but far too small for any serious open-water ambition. Each had its strengths, each its limitations, and the limitations always outweighed the possibilities. Sailors hugged coastlines not out of timidity, but out of a cold and rational understanding of what their ships could and could not do. To venture too far west into the Atlantic was not heroic. It was a reasonably certain way to disappear. And so, for generation after generation, the world remained the size that men's ships allowed it to be. Then, along the coastline of Portugal, quietly and without great announcement, something began to change. It did not arrive as a revolution. It never does. It arrived the way most world-altering things arrive, as a practical solution to a specific, frustrating problem. Portuguese mariners, pressed south along the African coastline by the ambitions of their prince, a man history would call Henry the Navigator, were sailing into winds and currents that their existing ships simply could not manage. The African coast pushed back. The ocean pushed back. And so, borrowing from the Arab and North African sailing traditions they encountered, blending them with what they knew, and refining through years of hard, salt-soaked trial and error, the Portuguese shipwrights of the 15th century produced something the world had never quite seen before. They called it the Caravella. We call it the Caravel. And the ocean, that vast grey wall at the edge of everything, would never be a boundary again. Part 2. The Shape of a New World. There is a particular kind of genius that does not announce itself. It does not arrive draped in ceremony or preceded by trumpets. It does not emerge fully formed from the mind of a single brilliant man in a single brilliant moment. The most consequential genius, the kind that actually reshapes the course of human events, tends to arrive gradually, almost shyly, through the accumulated wisdom of many hands working on the same stubborn problem over many years. It smells of sawdust and salt water. It lives in the curve of a plank, the angle of a mast, the precise geometry of a sail, catching a crosswind at 15 degrees. The Caravel was exactly this kind of genius, and to truly appreciate it, to feel the weight of what it represented, we need to slow down. We need to walk into a Portuguese shipyard sometime in the early to mid-15th century, breathe the air of fresh-cut oak and pine pitch, and look carefully at what these craftsmen were building, because the Caravel was not simply a better ship. It was a fundamentally different idea about what a ship could be. Let us begin with size, because size in this case is deeply instructive. The Caravel was small. Strikingly, almost surprisingly small by any standard we might apply today. The earliest Caravels measured somewhere between 50 and 100 tons of displacement. And to put that in perspective, the great Venetian merchant galleys of the same era could run to 300 or 400 tons without breaking a sweat. The Caravel carried perhaps 20 to 30 men on a typical voyage. It was, by the standards of its age, a modest vessel. And this modesty was not a limitation. It was a superpower. A small ship draws less water, meaning it can navigate shallower coastal regions, river mouths, and estuaries that would swallow a larger vessel whole. A small ship can be beached, inspected, repaired, and relaunched by a small crew with basic tools, which mattered enormously on voyages that took sailors thousands of miles from the nearest friendly port. A small ship responds quickly. It turns, it adjusts, it reacts to changing conditions with an agility that a great lumbering merchantman simply cannot match. Along the rocky, reef-scattered, unpredictable coastline of West Africa, where the Portuguese were pushing their explorations ever further south, this agility was not a luxury. It was the difference between coming home and not coming home at all. But the Caravel's true revolution, the thing that separated it from every ship that had come before, was not its size, it was its sails. To understand why the Caravel's rigging changed history, we need to pause for a moment on a concept that seems almost too simple to carry such enormous consequence. It is the concept of sailing into the wind. When we talk about wind in relation to a sailing ship, there are essentially three positions available. A vessel can sail downwind, with the wind pushing directly from behind, filling its sails and driving it forward. This is the easiest point of sail, intuitive, comfortable, the kind of sailing that feels like a gift. A vessel can also sail across the wind, with the breeze coming from the side, which is more complex but still manageable with the right sail design. And then there is the third possibility, sailing into the wind. Or more precisely, because no sailing ship can sail directly into the wind, sailing at an acute angle to it, sailing close-hauled as sailors say, beating upwind through a series of diagonal tacks, gaining ground against a headwind through patience and geometry. This third capability is the one that unlocks the ocean. Because the ocean, unlike a kind and cooperative river, does not arrange its winds for your convenience, The trade winds of the Atlantic blow in patterns that are consistent, but not infinitely accommodating. The winds off the coast of Africa can shift against you for days, for weeks. The winds of the open ocean vary by season, by latitude, by conditions you cannot predict from the shore. A ship that can only sail before the wind is a ship that is, in every practical sense, trapped. Trapped, waiting for the right conditions. Trapped by geography. Trapped by the atmosphere itself. The square sail, the sail that had driven European ships for centuries, was magnificent downwind, broad, billowing, capable of catching enormous quantities of air. It was perfectly designed for the moment the wind sat kindly at a ship's back. But close-hauled, angled into a headwind, the square sail became almost useless. It could not hold its shape against the side-on or forward wind with anything approaching efficiency. The ship would lose ground. It would drift sideways, what sailors call making leeway, slipping away from its intended course, carried helplessly by the very wind it was trying to use. The lateen sail was a different proposition entirely, triangular in shape, hung from a long, angled yard that crossed the mast diagonally. The lateen sail had been a feature of Arab and Mediterranean sailing for centuries. Arab dhows had used it to navigate the Indian Ocean with extraordinary skill. North African fishermen had used it along the Atlantic coast of Morocco. Portuguese coastal fishermen, watching those fishermen work, had absorbed its logic slowly, organically, the way practical knowledge always spreads, not through books, but through eyes that pay attention. The lateen sail's genius lies in its aerodynamics. Where the square sail works like a bag catching air, the lateen sail works more like a wing. Stretched taut and set at a precise angle to the wind, it generates lift, the same fundamental force that pulls an aircraft into the sky, rather than simply catching pressure. This lift, directed forward and slightly to the side, allows a vessel to make genuine progress against a headwind, not directly into it. No sailing ship can do that, but at an angle of perhaps 45 degrees or so to the wind's direction. Close-hauled, efficient, controlled. On the early Caravella Latina, the lateen Caravel, rigged entirely with these triangular sails on 2 or sometimes 3 masts. This capability was transformative. Portuguese explorers sailing south along the African coast, who had once been forced to wait for the wind to cooperate before they could even dream of returning home, could now tack back and forth against an opposing wind and actually make progress. Slowly, methodically, but progress nonetheless. The ocean had opened, just slightly, just enough. Now, the Caravel was not without its complications. No vessel of genius ever is. The lateen rig, for all its windward brilliance, had a significant flaw of its own, one that became apparent the moment the wind swung around to the vessel's stern. Downwind, the lateen sail was awkward, inefficient, working against itself. The very triangular shape that made it so elegant into the wind made it poor at capturing a following breeze. Sailors on a lateen Caravel running before a tailwind found themselves working harder for less speed than they should have had. The solution was characteristically Portuguese in its pragmatism. As the decades of exploration accumulated experience, and as shipwrights refined their designs through the hard currency of actual voyages, a second variant of the Caravel emerged. The Caravella Redonda, the round Caravel, combined the lateen sail's windward magic with square sails on the forward mast or masts. This hybrid arrangement allowed the Caravel to perform well in virtually any wind condition. Close-hauled into a headwind, the lateen sails drove the vessel forward with precision. Running downwind, the square sails on the foremost mast billowed out and added power and speed. It was an elegant compromise, a floating negotiation between competing demands, and it made the Caravella Redonda one of the most versatile sailing platforms the world had ever produced. This was the configuration that Christopher Columbus would favor. This was the configuration aboard the Nina and the Pinta, when they departed from Palos de la Frontera on the 3rd of August 1492, and it was this configuration that would carry those vessels across an ocean that European maps still marked at their western edges with nothing at all. But we are moving ahead of ourselves, as it is so easy to do when the destination is so dramatic. Let us return to the ship itself, and to the less celebrated but equally important details of its construction. Because the Caravel's significance was not only in its sails, it was in the whole integrated logic of the vessel, the way every element worked together to create something greater than the sum of its parts. The hull of the Caravel was built using a technique that was, in itself, a departure from older traditions. Much of European medieval shipbuilding had relied on clinker construction, planks overlapping each other like the scales of a fish or the clapboards of a house, each plank nailed to the one below it. Clinker hulls were strong, but they were also rigid and relatively heavy for their size, and they limited the shapes a shipwright could efficiently produce. The Caravel was built Caravel planked, and indeed some historians trace the very name of the vessel to this construction method, though the etymology remains a matter of gentle debate among scholars. In Caravel planking, the hull planks are laid edge to edge, smooth and flush against each other, fastened to an internal skeleton of frames and ribs. The result is a hull that is smoother, offering less resistance to the water, and, crucially, more adaptable in its shaping. A Caravel hull could be given a more rounded, deep-bodied form, which provided better stability in heavy ocean swells and allowed for a more useful cargo hold. And the hold, though modest, was sufficient. The Caravel was never a bulk cargo ship. It was an instrument of exploration, and as such, what it needed to carry was fairly specific. Provisions, water casks, navigational instruments, trade goods for encounters with unfamiliar peoples along unfamiliar coasts, weapons, anchors and spare rigging, and men. Not armies of oarsmen, but small, skilled, manageable crews who could work the sails, maintain the vessel, and survive for weeks or months at a time on the open ocean with a level of self-sufficiency that older ship types simply could not have managed. There is one more element of the Caravel's character that deserves to be understood before we sail with it into the voyages that would make it immortal. The Caravel was, by the accounts of those who sailed in it, a lively ship, a responsive ship, a ship that you could feel beneath your feet, not as a great groaning weight of timber reluctantly conceding to the sea, but as something almost animate. Sailors who had come from the galley tradition, where the ship responded to human muscle in a direct and physical way, found in the Caravel a different but equally intimate relationship. It answered the helm. It leaned into turns with a willingness that felt, on a good day, almost like eagerness. Vasco da Gama's pilots spoke of their Caravels with something approaching affection. Columbus, for all his impossible self-regard, saved some of his most unguarded admiration in his journal for the qualities of the Niña, a Caravel, which he called the best sailing vessel of his fleet. Bartholomew Diaz, the first European to round the Cape of Good Hope and prove that Africa did have a southern tip, that the Indian Ocean was reachable, accomplished that world-shattering feat in 2 Caravels. 2 small, modest, brilliant Caravels. The ship was not a monument. It was not built to impress from a harbor. It was built to work, and in working, tirelessly, reliably, across distances and in conditions that no European vessel had ever before survived. It quietly rewrote the map of the world. The age of exploration did not begin because men became braver. Men have always been brave. It began because, in the shipyards of Portugal, in the salt air of the Tagus and the Algarve, the right ship was finally, patiently, and brilliantly built. Part 3. The Prince Who Faced the Sea. There are men who change the world by conquering it. They ride at the head of armies. They plant flags on the rubble of cities they have taken by force. History remembers them loudly. Their battles, their victories, their names carved into stone. We know them well. We have always known them well. And then there are men who change the world by imagining it differently. Men who never fire a cannon, never lead a charge, never set foot on the shores their vision eventually reveals. Men who work not with swords, but with maps and mathematics and the slow, unglamorous machinery of sustained institutional will. These men are rarer, and in the long arithmetic of human consequence, they tend to matter more. Prince Henry of Portugal, Dom Henrique, third surviving son of King João I, was emphatically the second kind of man. He was born in 1394 in Porto, in a kingdom that was young and restless and perched, quite literally, at the western edge of the known world. To stand on the cliffs of the Algarve in the 15th century was to face an ocean that no European had successfully crossed, backed by a continent whose southern extent no mapmaker had ever traced. The unknown was not abstract for the Portuguese. It was right there, visible, pressing against the shoreline like something that wanted in. Henry felt that pressure more acutely than most, and he spent his life pressing back. He established himself at Sagres, a windswept promontory on Portugal's southwestern tip, jutting into the Atlantic like a raised fist. And there he built something that was less a court than a working institution. Cartographers, astronomers, mathematicians, experienced sailors from across the Mediterranean world, Arab navigators whose understanding of the African coast far exceeded anything the Portuguese then possessed. He gathered them, funded them, organized them, and pointed them all toward the same horizon. And critically, he built them the right ships to reach it. This is where the Caravel enters the story, not as a background detail, but as the story's central engine. Henry understood, with uncommon clarity, that the expeditions he was imagining could not be conducted in the vessels that currently existed. The galleys of the Mediterranean were unsuited to sustained ocean sailing. The broad-bellied cogs of northern Europe were too dependent on cooperative winds. What he needed was a ship that could go where no European ship had reliably gone before, along a coastline that ran for thousands of unknown miles to the south, into wind patterns and current systems that no pilot had ever recorded. And then, crucially, come back. The return was everything. An expedition that could not return brought back nothing. No charts, no knowledge, no pilots with the accumulated wisdom of what lay beyond the last known cape. Henry needed ships that could fight their way home against headwinds, that could navigate shallow coastal waters and river mouths, that could be maintained and repaired by small crews far from any friendly port. The Caravel answered every one of those demands. Developed and refined through the 1420s and 1430s in Portuguese shipyards, the early Caravel was lateen-rigged. Those distinctive triangular sails set at a sweeping diagonal angle from the masts. And it was this rig that gave Henry's exploration program its defining capability. The lateen sail could work a ship close to the wind, with an efficiency that no square-rigged vessel could approach. Where other ships waited, sometimes for weeks, for the wind to swing around behind them, the Caravel could angle into the wind and make genuine progress. Tack left, tack right, gain ground with every pass. Patient, methodical, unstoppable. Along the African coast, where the prevailing winds frequently blew from the north, precisely the direction a southward exploring ship needed to travel. This capability was not merely useful. It was the entire difference between exploration being possible and exploration being impossible. Year by year, Henry's caravels crept southward, and the story of that advance is, at its heart, the story of what those ships could endure and achieve. Cape Bojador was the first great test. Jutting from the coast to what is now Western Sahara, Beaujador had become, in the European imagination, the edge of the navigable world. For 15 years and 12 separate expeditions, Henry sent ships toward it. For 15 years they turned back, not because the Cape was physically impassable, but because the fears surrounding it had calcified into something almost theological. The currents beyond it, sailors said, ran irresistibly southward. The waters boiled. No ship had ever returned from past its headland, and the absence of evidence was taken as the most terrifying evidence of all. What those sailors lacked was not courage, it was confidence in their vessel. In 1434, a young squire named Gil Eanes provided both. He sailed a Caravel, small, responsive, sitting lightly in the water, slightly west, into the open Atlantic, gave the Cape a wide and unhurried berth, and came around its southern side without incident. The monsters were absent. The boiling water was a myth. There was only ocean and wind, and the Caravel doing precisely what it had been built to do. Holding its angle to the breeze, covering the miles, answering the helm with quiet consistency. The significance of that moment cannot be overstated. Gil Eanes did not conquer Cape Beaujador through superhuman daring. He sailed around it in a ship that was simply better than the fear. The Caravel had not just extended the range of exploration, it had dismantled the psychological architecture of limitation that had kept Europe penned at its own coastlines for generations. What followed over the next several decades was a methodical, relentless southward campaign, and throughout every league of it, the Caravel was the constant. Each successive expedition pushed further than the last. The captains kept careful records. The pilots documented the behavior of currents and winds with the attention of men who knew that future crews would depend on what they wrote down. And the Caravels carried all of it. Every new cape charted, every river mouth sounded, every star noted above a horizon no European eye had ever seen before. The equator was crossed, and the Caravel crossed it, still performing, still responsive, still managing in heat and wind conditions that its designers had never specifically prepared for, because no one yet knew what those conditions would be. The southern hemisphere's unfamiliar constellations rose one by one above the horizon, and through it all, the ship remained the one reliable constant, the one thing that did not surprise. This reliability was itself a revolutionary fact. Earlier ships had demanded so much of their crews, constant bailing, constant rowing, constant management of hulls that leaked and rigs that failed, that the sailor's energy was consumed by the vessel itself. The Caravel freed its crew. It required skilled handling, certainly, but it rewarded that skill rather than simply absorbing it. Men aboard a well-sailed Caravel had cognitive space to observe, to record, to navigate. The ship was doing its job, which allowed the men to do theirs. Henry died in 1460, at Sagres, having never seen Africa's southern tip. The continent had proven far larger than any map had suggested, and the question of whether it even had a navigable southern end remained stubbornly open at his death. But the institution he had built, and the ships he had championed, did not stop with him. The Caravels continued south under royal patronage, expedition by expedition, cape by cape, and in 1488, a captain named Bartholomew Diaz, commanding 2 Caravels, small ships, modest ships, ships that a person standing on a modern dock might look at with barely disguised skepticism, sailed into a storm of such ferocity that his crew lost all directional reference for days. When the violence finally subsided and the sea returned to something approaching reason, the pilots took their bearings and found that the coastline, which had run faithfully north to south for thousands of miles, now ran east to west. Africa had ended, not in myth, not on a map drawn by a scholar who had never left his study. In reality, in the spray and wind and cold southern swells, in the battered oak and pine and rope of 2 Caravels that had carried their crew to the bottom of the world and held together long enough to prove the impossible possible. Diaz named the headland the Cabo das Tormentas, the Cape of Storms, an honest name earned in violence. King João II of Portugal, understanding immediately and completely what his captain had achieved, renamed it with the full weight of what it promised, the Cape of Good Hope, because beyond it lay India, beyond it lay the spice routes, beyond it lay a world of almost incomprehensible wealth, waiting to be reached by anyone with the ships capable of getting there. Portugal had those ships. The Caravel had seen to that. Part 4. Into the absolute unknown. There is a morning that exists at the hinge of history, not a morning of cannon fire or collapsing walls, not a morning of crowns changing hands or treaties being signed in candlelit rooms, just a morning, salt air, a rising sun painting the estuary gold, the creak and knock of 3 ships being readied in a Spanish harbor. That would, before it was finished, divide human history into a before and an after so complete, so total, that we are still living in its aftermath more than 5 centuries later. That morning was the 3rd of August, 1492. The harbor was Palos de la Frontera, in the Spanish region of Andalusia. The river was the Rio Tinto, the Red River, stained rust by the iron-rich earth of its banks. And the 3 ships preparing to depart from its quay were, by almost any measure, an unimpressive fleet, modest in size, weathered from prior service, carrying 90 men between them into an ocean that, at its western edge, simply ran off every map that had ever been drawn. 2 of those 3 ships were caravels. And those 2 ships, more than any admiral's ambition, more than any royal patent or letter of commission, are the reason the voyage succeeded at all. To understand the fleet that Columbus assembled, we must first understand the man who assembled it, and the extraordinary difficulty of what he was actually proposing. Christopher Columbus, Cristobal Colon in the Spanish records, Cristoforo Colombo in the Genoese birth registers that recorded his arrival into the world sometime around 1451, was a sailor of genuine and considerable experience. He had sailed the Mediterranean. He had sailed north to England and possibly to Iceland. He had sailed south along the African coast on Portuguese expeditions, which meant he had sailed in caravels, had felt their particular responsiveness beneath his feet, and had formed opinions about them that would shape every decision of his great voyage. His theory that the world was round enough, and Asia close enough to the west, that a ship could reach it by sailing directly into the Atlantic, was not, by the standards of educated 15th century thought, especially radical. Educated Europeans had understood the world was spherical since ancient Greece. What was radical, and what the Portuguese Royal Council had rejected with considerable condescension when Columbus first presented his proposal, was his calculation of the distances involved. Columbus believed Asia lay roughly 3,000 miles to the west of the Canary Islands. The actual distance, of course, is closer to 12,000 miles, and his critics, whose mathematics were considerably better than his, told him so. They were right. He was wrong, and in the magnificent irony that history occasionally produces, his being wrong is precisely why he found what he found. But irony and mathematics were future problems. In the summer of 1492, Columbus had his royal commission from Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, his 3 ships, and his conviction. All he needed now was the right vessels to carry it. The flagship of the fleet was the Santa Maria. She was not a caravel, she was a nau, a larger, more heavily built type of vessel, sometimes called a carrack in the broader European tradition, broader in the beam than the caravels, with higher sides and a greater cargo capacity. The Santa Maria was the kind of ship that projected authority. It looked, from a harbor, like a ship worthy of an admiral. Columbus sailed aboard her by virtue of his rank, and spent significant portions of the subsequent voyage quietly wishing he had not. The Santa Maria was sluggish. She was. by Columbus's own account in his journal, a poor sailor. Heavy on the helm, slow to respond, more comfortable sitting still in a calm than working in any kind of serious sea. She was a ship designed for the relatively forgiving waters of established trade routes, not for the demands of sustained open ocean exploration. Columbus tolerated her. He never admired her. His admiration was reserved entirely for the two ships sailing in company. The Pinta was the first of the Caravels. Slightly larger than her companion, she was commanded by Martin Alonso Pinzon, a Palos sea captain of considerable reputation, whose local knowledge and whose ability to recruit experienced sailors from the harbor town had been, in practical terms, almost as important to the expedition's departure as Columbus's royal backing. The Pinta had been refitted before the voyage, new rigging, presumably a modified sail plan, and she proved throughout the crossing to be the fastest ship of the three, frequently pulling ahead of her companions and having to check her speed to remain in company. The Niña was the second Caravel, smaller than the Pinta, originally rigged entirely with lateen sails in the classic Caravella Latina configuration. She had been partially re-rigged during a stop at the Canary Islands. Her forward mast squared off to give her more downwind power for what everyone expected would be a long run before the trade winds. She was commanded by Vicente Yanez Pinzon, the younger brother of Martin Alonso, and she was, by Columbus's explicit and repeated testimony, the finest vessel in the fleet. He called her the best sailor among the three, praised her seakeeping, praised her handling, praised the way she moved through water with an efficiency that the heavier Santa Maria could not approach. When Columbus finally had to abandon the stricken Santa Maria on the coast of Hispaniola on Christmas Day, 1492, she ran aground on a reef in the night and could not be saved. It was to the Niña that he transferred his flag, his charts, and himself. The Caravel became, in the expedition's most desperate moment, the ship that mattered, the ship that would carry the news home. But we are running far ahead of ourselves. We are still in the harbor of Palos. The sun is still rising over the Rio Tinto. The ships are still being loaded. On the 3rd of August, 1492, before dawn, Columbus and his crew attended Mass at the Church of San Jorge. Then they walked down to the quay, boarded their vessels, and the lines were cast off. The fleet dropped down the river on the morning tide and turned southwest toward the Canary Islands, the standard staging point for any Atlantic venture, sitting conveniently in the latitude of the northeast trade winds that Columbus intended to use as his highway west. The Canaries were reached in 9 days. The stop lasted 3 weeks, repairing the Pinta's rudder, which had developed an ominous looseness, re-rigging the Niña, taking on fresh provisions and water. On the 6th of September, the fleet departed the Canaries and sailed west into the open Atlantic, into the absolute unknown. The crossing that followed lasted 33 days, 33 days of open ocean, with no land visible in any direction, no possibility of turning back to shore if something went catastrophically wrong, no charts that showed anything beyond the blank blue of theoretical space. 33 days during which 90 men were required to maintain faith in their admiral, in their instruments, in their calculations, and most fundamentally, in their ships. The two Caravels earned that faith every single day. The trade winds, exactly as Columbus had calculated, blew steadily from the northeast, and the fleet ran before them at speeds that genuinely surprised everyone aboard. The Caravels, with their modified rigs combining lateen and square sails, were in their element, running downwind in the consistent Atlantic trades. They covered distances that ranged from around 150 to 18 miles on good days. Remarkable progress for vessels of their size in the 15th century. The fleet was moving fast enough that Columbus, fearing his crew would grow alarmed by how far they had come from Spain, kept 2 separate logs, one accurate, one showing a deliberately reduced distance, which he shared with the men. The irony, discovered by later historians, was that his falsified log was often more accurate than his real one. His dead reckoning, for all his genius, contained consistent small errors. But the ships made no errors. They ran on, steady and true. The sea life fascinated and occasionally unnerved the sailors. Vast mats of sargassum weed, the floating golden meadows of the Sargasso Sea, appeared beneath the hulls and were interpreted, with understandable anxiety, as signs that the ocean was becoming shallow, that land must be close. It was not close. The pilots sounded the depth and found no bottom. The weeds were simply the weeds, a feature of the ocean that no European had ever encountered, and the Caravels pushed through them without difficulty. Their relatively shallow drafts and responsive handling meant that entanglement in the weed was never a serious threat. Larger, deeper ships might have found the Sargasso considerably more alarming. The crew's anxiety, however, was a different and more persistent matter. As September gave way to October and the trade winds continued to blow relentlessly westward, a disquiet settled over the men that Columbus struggled to manage. They had been at sea for weeks. No land had appeared. The winds that drove them so efficiently west also raised the question that was becoming impossible to ignore. If the winds always blew from the east, how would a ship ever sail back? Columbus had an answer for this. He had observed on his African voyages that winds at different latitudes blew in different directions, and he intended to sail north to find westerlies for the return. But knowing an answer and fully believing it at week 5 of an ocean crossing in a wooden ship 60 feet long are very different things. The Caravels could not resolve the crew's fear, but they could and did continue to perform. And performance in those weeks was its own kind of argument. A ship that leaked badly, that labored in the swells, that required constant desperate bailing and repair, communicates to its crew a message of fragility and doom. The Nina and the Pinta communicated nothing of the kind. They rode the Atlantic with a steadiness and assurance that was palpable. They were, by every account of the crossing that survives, good seaboats. Comfortable in the trade wind swells, quick on the helm, requiring the kind of ordinary and manageable maintenance that experienced sailors could conduct without alarm. The ships, in their reliability, were the expedition's most powerful argument for continuing. On the night of the 11th of October, 1492, a sailor aboard the Pinta named Rodrigo de Triana saw something in the darkness ahead. A light, then resolving in the pre-dawn hours into something more definite and more solid and more world-altering than any light. A low, dark line along the horizon that was unmistakably, unambiguously, impossibly real. Land. The Pinta's gun fired, the agreed signal, and the sound rolled across the water to where the Nina and the Santa Maria were sailing in the darkness. Columbus, who would later controversially claim the sighting credit for himself, came on deck. The fleet hove to and waited through the remaining hours of darkness. The Caravels riding the swells with their characteristic lightness, holding their position with their sails managed back, patient as the night. At dawn on the 12th of October, the fleet approached the island Columbus named San Salvador, and which the people already living on it, the Lucayan people called Guanahani, was a low, green, sun-warmed place in what we now call the Bahamas. The Lucayan people came to the water's edge and watched the ships approach. Columbus and his officers came ashore in boats. The admiral planted a flag and said some words about possession and sovereignty that meant nothing at all to the people watching from the tree line, whose world was not, from their perspective, available to be possessed or claimed by a group of pale, overdressed men arriving in wooden boats. But the moment itself was real. The contact was real, and the ships that had carried it into being, those two modest, brilliant caravels riding quietly at anchor in a Caribbean bay, their lateen sails furled, their hulls warm from weeks of Atlantic sun, were as real and as consequential as anything that ever sailed. The return voyage confirmed everything that the Caravel's admirers had always argued about them. Columbus sailed north from the Caribbean until he found the westerlies, the mid-latitude winds that blow reliably from west to east across the North Atlantic, and then turned his ships toward home. The Santa Maria was gone by this point, wrecked on the Hispaniola Reef. The Niña and the Pinta made the crossing together, running before the westerlies in seas that were considerably rougher and more testing than the gentle trade wind passage outward. They were separated by a brutal mid-Atlantic storm in February of 1493, a storm severe enough that Columbus, aboard the Niña, feared he would not survive it. He wrote a summary of his voyage on parchment, sealed it in a barrel, and threw it into the sea, hoping that even if the ship were lost, the knowledge might somehow reach Spain. The Niña did not sink. She rode the storm out, heeled hard, working in the swells, taking spray aboard, but fundamentally sound and fundamentally seaworthy in conditions that many larger vessels would not have survived in the same state. She limped into Lisbon on the 4th of March, 1493. The Pinta had already found her way back separately, arriving at the Spanish port of Bayona a few days earlier. Both caravels had made it. Both crews had made it. The news they carried would remake the world so completely, so irreversibly, that no map drawn after 1492 would ever again resemble a map drawn before it. And the ships that carried that news, smaller than many vessels tied up in any European harbor that morning, less imposing than the great carracks and galleys of the age, built of ordinary materials by ordinary craftsmen in the ordinary shipyards of Portugal and Spain, were caravels. Always at the center of everything, caravels. Part 5. The shape of everything. After, when a stone is dropped into still water, the splash is immediate and dramatic, but the splash is not the story. The story is the rings, slow, outward-moving circles that expand long after the stone has settled, reaching shores. The stone itself never touched, disturbing surfaces that had no reason to expect disturbance, carrying energy from a single point of impact to distances that seem, at first, impossible to connect back to the original event. The story is what travels, what persists, what reshapes the edges of things quietly and permanently, long after the moment of impact has passed from memory. The Caravel was the stone, and the rings are still moving. In the years immediately following Columbus's return to Spain in 1493, something shifted in the consciousness of Europe. Not all at once, not with the clean finality of a door closing, but gradually, the way light changes in a room when a cloud moves off the sun. The world was not what it had been assumed to be. It was larger. It was stranger. It contained peoples and places and possibilities that no scripture, no classical text, no medieval map had ever accounted for. And the vessel that had revealed this, the small, lateen-rigged, Caravel-planked Caravel, was suddenly the most studied, most imitated, and most coveted ship type in Europe. Every maritime nation that understood what had just happened began, with varying degrees of urgency, to understand the Caravel. Portugal, which had been building and refining caravels for the better part of a century, moved with characteristic efficiency. Vasco da Gama's fleet, which departed Lisbon in 1497 to complete the project that Bartholomew Dias had begun, rounding Africa and reaching India by sea, included caravels in its complement. The voyage took over 10 months. It covered roughly 24,000 miles. It crossed seas of a difficulty and ferocity that the Atlantic crossing, for all its psychological weight, did not fully approach. The Indian Ocean in monsoon season is a different proposition from the gentle trade wind passage of the Caribbean approach. Da Gama's ships faced headwinds, equipment failure, scurvy, hostile encounters, and the vast indifference of an ocean that did not care whether they survived or not. They survived. The caravels among them performed. And when da Gama returned to Lisbon in 1499, he brought with him spices and proof of concept. The sea route to India was real. It was navigable, and Portugal now owned it. The commercial consequences were immediate and staggering. Lisbon, overnight, became one of the most important ports in the world. The Italian spice monopoly, built over centuries of patient Mediterranean trading, began to crumble almost immediately. The center of European economic gravity shifted from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic seaboard, and it has never entirely shifted back. But the Caravel's influence was not merely a matter of which voyages it enabled. Its influence ran deeper than any single expedition, any single discovery, any single rerouting of the spice trade. Its influence was architectural. It changed how human beings thought about building ships, and in doing so, changed how they thought about the sea itself. Before the Caravel, the dominant philosophy of European shipbuilding was essentially conservative. Ships were built to manage known waters, known routes, known seasonal conditions. They were optimized for specific trades: the Baltic timber run, the Mediterranean grain and wine circuit, the North Sea wool passage, and the optimization was narrow and local. You built the ship for the route you knew. The idea of building a ship for routes not yet discovered, for conditions not yet experienced, for distances not yet contemplated, was not part of the vocabulary. The Caravel introduced that vocabulary. Its design principles, the Caravel planked hull that could be shaped for ocean swells rather than coastal chop, the mixed sail plan that could handle wind from any direction, the shallow draft that allowed coastal and deep water work from the same vessel, the modest size that prioritized range and agility over raw cargo capacity, became the template against which subsequent ship designers measured themselves, not always by copying, sometimes by arguing with it, modifying it, pushing it in directions the original Portuguese shipwrights had never intended. The galleon, which would come to define European naval power through the 16th and 17th centuries, owed a direct and acknowledged debt to the Caravel. It was larger, yes, far larger, capable of carrying far greater armament and cargo, but its hull form, its sail plan logic, its fundamental understanding of how a deep-water ocean-going vessel should be proportioned and rigged, traced back through the Caravel to those early Portuguese experiments on the Tagus and the Algarve coast. The great ships of the Spanish Armada, the English East Indiamen, the Dutch fluits that would come to dominate the world's carrying trade in the 17th century, all of them carried, somewhere in their design DNA, the genetic material of that small, revolutionary, underappreciated vessel. The world that the Caravel built was not, it must be said with honesty, an uncomplicated gift. The same voyages that expanded European geographical knowledge also initiated processes of colonization, enslavement, and cultural destruction, whose consequences were catastrophic for the peoples on the receiving end of them. The same ships that carried explorers and cartographers also carried soldiers, missionaries, and slave traders. The opening of the Atlantic was simultaneously the opening of the Atlantic slave trade, one of the most sustained and devastating crimes in human history, and the Caravel was implicated in that too. Portuguese caravels were among the first European vessels to transport enslaved Africans across the ocean, beginning in the 1440s, decades before Columbus ever sailed. The ship that discovered the world also participated in the mechanisms by which that world was violently reorganized for European benefit. This complexity is not a footnote, it is part of the Caravel story, and honesty requires that it be told in the same breath as the story of the lateen sail and the windward tack, and the brave men who rounded Africa's southern cape. The world the Caravel made was a world of breathtaking expansion and breathtaking cruelty, often conducted by the same hands, often aboard the same vessels, often in the name of the same crowns. History, in its fullness, rarely allows us the comfort of an unclouded hero. The Caravel was a tool, magnificent revolutionary, and morally indifferent as all tools are. What mattered, as it has always mattered, was the intentions and the choices of the human beings who held its ropes and worked its sails. By the middle of the 16th century, the Caravel's moment as the primary instrument of exploration was beginning to pass. The world's major ocean routes were now established. The trade winds of the Atlantic and the monsoon cycles of the Indian Ocean were charted, understood, and reliable enough to be exploited commercially on a massive and sustained scale. What those commercial operations needed was not the Caravel's particular genius for exploration. Its windward ability, its agility, its capacity to function in unknown waters without support. What they needed was volume, cargo capacity, the ability to carry thousands of tons of spices, sugar, silver, and enslaved human beings across oceans whose moods, by now, were at least partially understood. The great carracks, and later the galleons, answered that need in ways the Caravel never could. They were bigger, more imposing, and more profitable. And profitability, once the age of pure exploration gave way to the age of colonial extraction, was the metric that mattered most. The Caravel did not disappear. It continued to be built and sailed for generations. As a coastal trader, as a dispatch vessel, as a naval scout and courier, as a fishing boat along the Portuguese and Spanish Atlantic coasts. But it retreated from the front line of history. It became background, utility, infrastructure, the kind of vessel that serious men of commerce sailed without thinking much about what it was or where it had come from. And the world it had built moved on, as worlds always do, without pausing to acknowledge the debt. There is a particular quality of late afternoon light on the water that seems to ask nothing of the people who observe it. It does not demand to be understood or analyzed or placed in historical context. It simply falls, golden and unhurried, across whatever surface it finds. Harbor water, open ocean, the wake of a small wooden vessel running before a favorable wind. It has been falling for as long as there has been water to fall upon. It fell on the harbor at Palos on the morning of August the 3rd, 1492. It fell on the swells of the mid-Atlantic as the Niña and the Pinta drove westward through the trade wind nights. It fell on the green coastline of San Salvador as Rodrigo de Triana's shout crossed the water and the world changed. Light does not know that it is witnessing history. It simply illuminates. The Caravel was something like that light. It was not built with a consciousness of its own significance. It was not designed by men who understood that they were creating the instrument of a global transformation. It was designed by practical men solving practical problems. How do we sail further south? How do we come home against the headwind? How do we build something small enough to work coastal shallows and strong enough to survive open ocean? The revolution was a byproduct of the pragmatism. The world remade itself, almost incidentally, around a set of shipbuilding decisions made in Portuguese yards by craftsmen, whose names, in almost every case, history has not preserved. This is perhaps the most quietly extraordinary thing about the Caravel story. The men who built it did not know they were building the future. They were building a better way to sail. The future arrived on its own, carried in the hull and the rigging and the particular aerodynamic genius of a triangular sail catching a crosswind at 45 degrees. We live, still, in the world the Caravel made. The global trade networks that define our economies trace back to the routes those ships first opened. The political borders of North America, South America, Africa, and Asia were redrawn, violently, comprehensively, and with consequences still unresolved, by the colonial enterprises that followed in the Caravel's wake. The languages spoken on continents where other languages had been spoken for thousands of years were changed by the same process. The animals, the crops, the diseases, the peoples themselves, all were reshuffled by the Columbian Exchange, that vast biological and cultural mixing that began the moment a caravel first dropped anchor in a Caribbean bay and a sailor waded ashore onto sand that no European foot had ever touched. All of it, the world as it exists today, in its extraordinary, troubled, interconnected, globally entangled complexity, flows from that hinge point, from those voyages, from those ships, from two triangular sails filling with a trade wind on a September morning, carrying 90 men into an ocean that had no western shore on any map that had ever been drawn. The Niña disappears from the historical record sometime around 51 or 5002. No one recorded the end of her. No one wrote down the final voyage, the final cargo, the final morning. Her crew walked her decks. She simply stops appearing in documents the way ordinary working vessels always do, used until they could no longer be used, and then quietly retired or broken up for timber with none of the ceremony their service deserved. She was, at the time of her disappearance from the record, perhaps 15 years old. She had crossed the Atlantic multiple times. She had survived storms that frightened experienced sailors into theological terror. She had carried the news of a new world back to an old one, had been the ship her admiral trusted most when everything else was failing, had done her work with such steady and unassuming competence that the man who sailed her praised her in his journal with the unguarded warmth of genuine admiration. And then she was gone, as all ships eventually are, leaving only the water behind. But the world she helped to find, the world she helped to make, remained. It remains still. Every map you have ever looked at, every trade route that moves goods from one continent to another, every language spoken in a place it was not spoken 500 years ago, every border, every coastline, every city built where no European city stood before, all of it carries, at its most fundamental origin point, the quiet signature of a small Portuguese ship with triangular sails and a shallow draft, and the remarkable, world-altering ability to sail into the wind. The Caravel did not conquer the world. It simply showed us that the world was there, and everything. Every extraordinary, terrible, beautiful, consequential thing that followed began in that showing.